So a lot of you guys are probably wondering, are mason jars going to come back on the market in a reasonable stock by December? I think that's the last article I read, was that they were expecting the stock to pick up by December. And I do think it's going to pick up by December, but I don't think it's going to stay there.
The COVID-19 pandemic has created a lot of unexpected shortages throughout the country, and now there is another one that has cropped up. All those canning supplies. Fox 9's Rob Olson tells us how the demand for jars and the lids that go on those jars is putting a lot of people in a pickle.
So some people have been asking us to make some canning videos, and I think the best thing you could do if you're new to canning is to follow a book. This is called Not Yo Mama's Canning Book, and this is a great canning book. It's got a lot of different recipes in there. The reason why I would follow a recipe book is because if you get, you know, the acidity level or pH or anything off wrong when you're canning, the food can spoil, it could go bad, and you don't want that. You want to have it working out just nice. It's a bit of a chemistry thing, so definitely follow the book. Now these pears here are ginger pears, and they came out of this book. These are pears in water, and these are pears in syrup. And from what we've read, you can can them in just plain water like we did here, just fine. And we got that outside of the book. We haven't tried these, so I don't know yet, but these have been in water now for quite some time, and obviously they seem to be doing just fine. The big thing, the reason why we did it without the syrup is because you put so much sugar into these, and the sugar isn't really a preservative, it's just there. It definitely tastes good. I love this recipe. The ginger essence on the pears is actually very good, kind of a fall taste. I like it. We've also been making things like pickled tomatoes and pickled pickles. And then she's also made some kind of like a Mexican tomato soup, which actually makes good spaghetti sauce. Go figure. I don't know. It's just the way the flavors mix. I've pulled it out of the pantry before and just thrown it into all sorts of things. It's definitely fun canning your own food. And some of the recipes are super good. I mean, these taste 10 times better than the pears you get in a can at the store. And I think that's been one of the problems with canning this year. It's not that it tastes better, but the fact that all of us are starting to can. So many people have turned to canning, or should I say jarring, because you're putting it into a jar instead of a can, so it's not really canning, it's jarring. But there's so many people out there that have gotten into food preservation this year. The last time we saw something like this happen, and it's not, you know, I've heard a lot of people commenting that there's a shortage on the lids, and I think it's a tin shortage, but it's actually a shortage on the jar and the lids. It's a shortage on the whole shebang. And so the problem that we have here is very similar to 1975. In 1975, we left the period of economic prosperity post-World War II, and we went into a recession around 1973. So by 1975, a lot of people had gotten into preserving food because it's a good way to save money. If you have food growing on your property, like we have a lot of pears, if you can figure out a way to preserve that, that's food that you don't have to buy. You can supplement the food into meals, you can find recipes to work with what you have, but you have to be able to preserve it. And so back in 1975, you had a ton of people really getting into the whole gardening thing and preserving their food. Just like at the beginning of this year, we had a lot of victory gardens started all across the US. In fact, we saw a seed shortage earlier this year. Of course, if you watch channels like Ice Age Farmer or Adapt 2030 or even us, we all talked about the possibilities of a seed shortage at the end of 2019. going into 2020, and part of that seed shortage was more or less on the commercial side. We were talking about plants that were grown for seed stock, and the way that things just went last year, we didn't plant nearly as much and harvest nearly as much as we had expected to. In fact, I believe last year I said that by September, the USDA would lower its estimates for stocks because it had overestimated, and in fact, they just didn't. It was a pretty big upset. It actually sent a lot of grain prices higher. What was that? Was it this week or late last week when they came out with that report? I can't remember. I'll post a link to it somewhere, or at least an image of it on the screen here for you. But basically, we didn't end up with as much as we were hoping we would. So we had less seeds this year, and we had a hard time for a lot of people getting the seeds. We had a lot of our seeds for this year. We did buy a few new seeds, and this year we've started harvesting a lot of our seeds. So as we've harvested plants, we've been harvesting the seeds as well. We've been harvesting grape seeds. We've been harvesting seeds from plants we buy at the store, just trying to get our own collection of seeds. And don't tell anybody that, because I heard somewhere it's illegal to harvest seeds from plants at the store. But anyway, so there's a lot of things that we've been doing differently this year to prepare for next year. Food preservation is something that we've been new to and we've been getting into. But I have noticed, just like the seed shortage, we started to have a mason jar shortage midway through the summer as everybody with all those victory gardens started harvesting, and they would go to the store and buy jars and lids. You can't reuse the lids. You have to get a new lid every single time. I'm sure some people are going to say, no, that's a fairy tale. They're just trying to get you to buy more. But there is a seal on these, and if that seal is broken and pieces of it stay behind or it's compromised, you're not going to preserve your food very well. So it's a good idea to get new lids. Anyway, it created a supply and demand shortage. This has nothing to do with tin, a shortage on tin. And with aluminum, we saw a similar thing happen. A lot of people went out and started buying canned drinks and storing them, stockpiling them. And so that created an aluminum can shortage. But there is plenty of tin and there's plenty of aluminum. It's just a matter of the manufacturers catching up. Just as there's plenty of sand to make the jars that we have for preserving our food, but the manufacturers have to get caught up. And I'm sure that by December we're going to see the stockpiles increase because people aren't preserving food in December, not as much as they are during the fall when they're harvesting their fall crops. And so that's why, you know, when you read some of these articles saying, you know, we'll restock by December, I agree with that. You're probably going to see prices fall. If you don't have jars with lids right now and you don't need them, if you can make it till December, I'm sure that we're going to see at least an improvement in availability, and usually when there's an improvement in availability, there is a reduction in the price. But there are, if you need them now, there are some spots. I found them in limited locations on Amazon.com. My wife and I buy from a bulk website. I'd have to check with her what that is, but they have plenty of them. And we also buy a lot of grains from that bulk site as well. A lot of this stuff is a supply and demand issue. Now, I did look into iron ore, by the way, because iron ore is another interesting issue that I've seen. Just this past week, a lot of the steel industry folks in India, the unions have been writing to the government asking them to stop exports of iron ore because it's driving up the cost of iron ore to the point where the secondary steel market in India is starting to fail. And so India may be considering stopping exports of iron ore, at least temporarily, which would be a pretty big deal because I think that they're ranked number 4 when it comes to mining iron ore. The U.S. is somewhere around number 9. The big buyer of iron ore has been China. China has been buying up Brazil and India iron ore and really anywhere it can get it like mad. And part of that is a supply and demand issue because China is doing a lot to bolster its economy through infrastructure spending. And so you're seeing a lot of need for steel, and they have to build more submarines and tanks and warships. So there's definitely a need there for steel. It's interesting, you know, when you look at China and you look at their COVID-19 numbers, they're extremely low compared to everybody else. I often wonder, you know, how much China is, you know, being honest about what they're using the steel for, or even their COVID-19 numbers. But, it's not up to me to judge. All I can say is it looks suspicious. Anyway, so China's been buying up all of the iron ore. We had a big steel manufacturer have to close one of their mines down in Brazil due to a lawsuit. Basically, their lease was up. There was a discrepancy in their lease paperwork, and so that has to work itself out. So you've got a couple hiccups in the iron ore industry, which are going to create a supply issue. But again, that shouldn't affect mason jars, lids, and aluminum cans. That should only affect steel. So things like cars, tools, appliances, everything else that you need could go up in the near future. If you wanted to kind of figure out next year and where we're headed, you can kind of look at the economy and look at the pandemic situation to get a pretty good idea of where we might end up next year as far as all of this goes. And I think that realistically speaking, we're going to have a lot of people doing the victory garden thing again, because as we get into the fall, we're starting to see these spikes in COVID-19 again. And a lot of them are uncontrolled. We haven't been doing contact tracing, not the way we were, during the first issue with COVID. This time around, it's been a lot more sloppy. I mean, UK, for example, they misread about 16,000 tests. It was something ridiculous like that. I mean, they had a huge spike, and I've noticed a correction in North Carolina cases just about last week. So there's definitely been some issues with testing. The test results are either false positives or false negatives. They're just false a lot of the times. And so the contact tracing thing hasn't really been working because nobody really knows who's had it, who doesn't have it. It's just kind of... So as we go into the fall, we could actually see a larger outbreak than we saw in the spring, because it's more widespread, and people are less careful because they've been around it for a while. They feel comfortable, and then you also have people traveling. You have trick-or-treaters for Halloween. You have people going to visit their families at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and so there's just all sorts of eventful things that happen around the holiday season that's going to make it relatively hard to contain. I think the American people and people around the world in general, quite frankly, are tired of having to sit at home and hide behind a mask, and so it makes it a lot more difficult to predict what's going to happen with that in the future. We've already seen New York start to lock some areas back down again. I talked about that in my last video. It seems like since Trump has been diagnosed with COVID-19, we're starting to see the statistics miraculously rise extremely quickly. So that's something to keep an eye on. And because of that, I think that we will be going into the winter time and probably January, February, with people still having troubles with this. And so you wouldn't surprise me if we see more victory gardens going into the spring of 2021, which means that there will be issues with seeds again. That also means that there's going to be issues with mason jars. The best time to buy seeds would be as soon as they come on the market for next year. So if you can find seeds or available seeds anywhere, I'd go ahead and buy them. And really, it's always a good time to stock up on mason jars before the rush hits. I mean, if you wait until it's time to harvest your garden, everybody's doing that, and everybody's buying jars at once. That pushes the prices up. It's like buying propane in the middle of wintertime. Everybody that uses natural gas and propane is driving the price of it up. If you buy it in the middle of the summertime, you save a considerable amount of money. It's just when we're not using something, we don't think about it, and so we don't take advantage of the lower prices. Looking at the economy going forward, regardless of who we put in office, whether it's Trump or Biden, the statistics of a president's first year in office, or even the first year reelected into an office, aren't very good for the markets. They're usually to the downside. This year, the markets have been pricing in a lower possibility of Trump getting reelected. Of course, if you look at the 2016 election period, they actually had him ranked even lower as a possibility to win. So according to how investors are looking at this election, they actually are giving Trump a higher chance of winning this time around than they did back in 2016. But even then, when you get a surprise for the election, when somebody wins that was largely unexpected for the markets. You have a correction that occurs from people reallocating their portfolios. And I think that as we get closer to the elections and people start changing their viewpoints on who might win or who might lose, you're going to see a lot of reallocation. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see a substantial trading volume increase. The other thing is that the investment banks have no idea what's going on right now. Some of the investment banks have been predicting, the markets to go higher. Some have been predicting the markets to go lower. I think the last Bank of America prediction for the S&P was between 2,200 and 4,000. It's comical how lost our biggest investment institutions are in this current market. And there's a lot of things to be concerned with. I was talking about the 1975 recession, which was an interesting recession if you look at today's market and what's going on today, because in 1975, you actually had a very high number of unemployment. Very similar to today, low interest rates, skyrocketing inflation. They call it stagflation. And I think that we're kind of looking at a similar situation right now, but I think there could be a second dip to all of this, and we may actually be entering it now. The markets have been trending a little sloppily lately. They've been unsure, and that's usually a pretty good sign that they could pull back. But anyway, in 1975, there was the recession, and then another interesting correlation that I've noticed about today's economy versus history. History doesn't always repeat itself, but we can learn from it. In 1945, for the first time ever, U.S. debt exceeded GDP because of World War II. And this month, see, in June, our debt exceeded GDP, but I think this month is the actual trigger for it because GDP this year has dropped. But we have exceeded the amount of debt. We're several years early for our debt to exceed GDP. And a lot of people don't think this is a problem, and they'll actually go back and reference 1945. They'll say it's a modern economy, the confidence in the dollar will never go away. But I think that the illusion will fall apart sometime soon, and I think that it will begin to fall apart in 2021. And so regardless of who's elected, we're going to face a very turbulent economy in 2021. And a lot of it has to do with our debt. We can't just keep printing money and keep growing our debt. That's not how things work. I think everybody who has ever had a credit card knows the danger in that. And so what we need to do is start looking at ways that we can protect ourselves as individuals if the dollar crashes. Because if the dollar crashes, we're going to see a significant amount of inflation. And the way that the Fed has been printing money to buy U.S. debt. See, that's another thing, is that the articles I read talk about how our debt is still maintaining very low interest rates, and so it would be easy for the government to pay it back over time, and the government can easily afford to exceed its GDP with debt. And the biggest problem that I see is that a lot of these notes and things are due in 5, 10 years. Even following the 2008 crisis, we still have notes that are coming up to be due from that time frame. So, and this particular year has been enormous. So when those notes come due, I don't think it's going to be pretty. Anyway, so interest rates right now are extremely low. They've been low because the Fed keeps buying the debt. See, the Fed is just printing money to buy the government's debt. But eventually that cycle has to stop, and eventually the interest rates will go up, which will make the cost of the debt extremely expensive for the United States, especially since we either need to buy the debt by creating more debt to buy the debt and then pay a higher interest on it in the future, or we default on it in the future. One or the other, but it's not going to be able to maintain itself. In 1945, we did hit a period of economic growth, a very long period of economic growth. I don't think that's going to happen in this situation. We had a very long period of economic growth, and the markets have tried to correct themselves multiple times between 2008 and now with the pandemic. A lot of people think that we had the hottest economy ever before the pandemic, but if you guys recall, last December I posted a video talking about how the future of our economy didn't look so bright. You can't just rev an engine forever and expect it to not fail at some point in time, and that I think is still around the corner. The pandemic, if anything, has stalled that from happening. which I know is kind of weird to say because we stalled the entire economy, but it has stalled that from happening. If you look at the unemployment numbers, they're actually not that great. We've still got millions of people that are unemployed. We're seeing the manufacturing index tick up a little bit from where it was, but it's still nothing to be proud of. And I think that a lot of that uptick in the manufacturing index, I think a lot of the numbers that we're seeing are numbers that are reflecting an economy that dropped extremely quickly and bounced back, but it didn't fix the problems that we had before this pandemic started. If you remember, before this entire thing started, the Fed was having to buy default swaps. They were having to buy up debt from the banks to keep our financial institutions afloat. That was happening literally a month before this entire pandemic situation. And so as we kind of get the gears rolling again, we're still going to hit those obstacles because none of them were fixed before. Only this time we're going to hit them with even less people employed, and a lot of people have permanently lost their jobs because, as the pandemic kicked in, there were a lot of things that replaced those people. There's been a lot of technology over the years replacing jobs. There's just simply not a need for everybody in our population anymore in the job market, and that's coming from the words of a few Democratic elite.
Now comes the information economy. And the information economy is fundamentally different because it's built around replacing people with technology. And you can't say to them they should go and create jobs deliberately. It's very, very hard to do, and nobody's really showed they could do it. And there's individual cases where you can retrain. I don't want to overstate it.
So we can't expect things to just go back to the way that they were. And, in 1945, when we did see the economy grow substantially after World War II and offset a lot of that debt that we had incurred, we also had seen a very large decrease in population. World War II wiped out 70 to 85 million people. It was devastating. And while the coronavirus has been devastating, it has not been that devastating. And when you have that big of a drop in population, you basically have a redistribution of wealth. It's a different form of redistribution of wealth than what some people marching on the street want, but it's still a redistribution of wealth. And it also depletes competition, allows people to succeed a little easier. And so that is, I think, a lot of the factors that went into the economic growth we saw post 1945 before we started to see recessions again in the 60s and 70s. So when it comes to canning jars, which is what I started out on, and I always go off on a tangent because as I research these things, I go through a bunch of little rabbit holes. And my mind learns a lot of things. But when it comes to mason jars and canning jars, I actually think that as we go through this fall and winter, we're going to start feeling some turbulence. After the election, there are a lot of people saying that it could take weeks to determine who the president is. I think it could take months to determine who the president is. I think it could take months to determine who our Congress is going to be made up of and our senators. I think there's going to be a lot of recounts. You have to figure this is an unprecedented election when it comes to mail-in ballots. All of those mail-in ballots have to be counted. And neither party, regardless of what the media says, neither party necessarily trusts the original count. And so we're going to end up with a lot of suits, a lot of lawsuits trying to determine who won what. And I think that's going to tie up the courts quite a bit. As we tie up the courts with a lot of uncertainty after the election, it's going to cause a lot of uncertainty in the public realm. They're expecting some unrest from this. In fact, Google has recently announced that they're holding back any political campaigns immediately following the election while the counting's going on, because they don't want to deal with, they don't want to add to the unrest. But we all know that we're kind of heading into this tricky time frame. My suggestion to all of you would be to keep it together and not go out and try and fight against what you consider tyranny, or because both sides consider each other tyranny in their own way. The truth is that, when it comes to our country, there are a lot of other countries that would love to see us fall apart over something like this. And so if we are going to be true Americans, we need to figure out a way to keep it together. But I do think that uncertainty, that period of time of uncertainty, is going to cause a lot of financial uncertainty. It may cause some hiring freezes as companies try and navigate what the future environment is going to hold for them. We have two very different political plans put in front of us. One protects independent capitalism. The other one is looking for a way of redistributing the wealth, the opportunity. Depending on who ends up getting elected is going to have a different impact on the economy. Either way, once we get into 2021, statistically, the markets would see a more of a roller coaster year in 2021. And I think that we can expect that regardless of who gets elected into office. And then obviously, I think that with all of this going on, the fact that we've got such a long road to travel before we see any normalcy in the markets, this debt situation is going to continue to roll out of hand. And we can sit there and pretend all we want to that we can just keep growing the debt, keep growing the balance sheet, everything will be fine. But eventually, people are going to lose faith in the currency. When that happens, it doesn't even have to be our country. If it happens to any country, we're going to start to see the ship sink. And so for the next 10 years, I think this is going to play out in a period of stagflation, high unemployment, a lot of uncertainty in the markets. And so when it comes to things like Victory Gardens, I think that they're going to become popular again. I think that they're going to become popular for a longer period of time than they were in 1975, which means that mason jars and seeds and things like that will continue to run out of stock each season, because it's going to be hard to figure out a way to grow the stockpile of that when it seems like it's to Ball, for example. They don't want to increase manufacturing unnecessarily, and then all of a sudden they have more overhead than they can handle because the sales of mason jars drop off. People lose interest in Victory Gardens. It's too big of a gamble for them to just pick up production. What they're going to do is try and maximize production at their current level and take advantage of the market, and then as things settle back down, their overhead will be the same as it was before. But as I said, I think that over the next 10 years, we're going to be facing these economic uncertainties, which is going to push more people to create their own food. That's the best way to hedge inflation, is to create your own food. We've already seen food prices are one of the fastest rising things that we've seen throughout this pandemic, and really for the past 2 years. And the food situation is much, much worse than the pandemic. It's been going on for quite some time. It's been going on for a couple years, and as far as I can tell, and many other analysts can tell, we're going to continue to see these issues with our ability to grow food into the near to distant future, especially with extreme weather events. And really, you can take that on either side you want to, global warming or grand solar minimum. No matter how you look at it, food production goes down. Anyway, that was just a little thought I had about mason jars when I was thinking about December and wondering if I should stock up or buy more Christmas presents. And I think this year we might be stocking up on some mason jars. But again, make sure that you also stock up on some lids. Right now, I think it might actually be easier to get your hands on some lids than the jars themselves. I've seen a lot of the kits that come with the jars and the lids sold out, from Target to Walmart to Tractor Supply. You name it. A lot of those places are sold out. I have found them on Amazon. I'll post some links below, but again, they're limited stock. And then I'll also post some links to some lids, because once you have these jars, you can reuse them unless you get a crack around the top. You can continue to reuse them, but replace the lid, because the lid, if it's not properly sealed, could cause some problems with contamination. Now, I'm not sure exactly, I would love it if somebody could comment below and point me in the direction of a way to create a different bond, kind of a homemade seal that works, that's efficient, because then you could reuse these lids and that would save a lot of money as well. Anyway, happy harvest, can if you can, and I will, or jar if you can, jarring, happy jarring, and I'll talk to you guys next time.